In this video, we're going to talk about immigration to the United States, and then we're going to look at internal migration within the United States. Let's start with the timeline of U.S. immigration. We're going to look at three major periods: the colonial period, 19th century and early 20th century immigration, and late 20th century immigration. When we look at colonial immigration, we're talking about Northern and Western Europeans being pushed out of Europe for economic reasons, for religious reasons, and up until 1840, 90% of them were British. The Puritans are a great example of one of these groups. The Puritans were a group of Protestant Christians who wanted to purify and reform the Church of England. They thought priests and bishops had way too much power over the church members, but the king absolutely refused to allow Puritans to criticize church actions at all. The most extreme of them wanted to separate from the Church of England altogether, and they became known as separatists. They formed their own churches, and they cut all ties with the Church of England. In response, the Church of England goes after the separatists. They want to punish the separatists. A way to remember this is to remember the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were a separatist group that decided to leave England in the early 1600s to escape this religious persecution. Another group of immigrants who came to North America to escape religious persecution were the Quakers. You've probably seen this Quaker Oats box. A lot of people think it's William Penn who founded Pennsylvania as a safe haven for Quakers. It's not, but it is a Quaker dude on the box nonetheless. Quakers believe that everyone can have a direct personal relationship with God. You don't need a priest, you don't need a minister. They also believe that heaven happens here and now on earth. They refuse to participate or fight in any wars. They refuse to swear an oath or pledge any allegiance to a nation or a king. And a lot of these beliefs are going to get them in trouble with the Church of England. So just like the Puritans did, they leave Europe, they come to North America for greater religious freedom. As far as the 1800s and early 1900s go, there are three peaks or three main waves of immigration we'll talk about. The first peak occurs between 1840 and 1850 and was composed mainly of Irish and German immigrants. In other words, again, we see mainly Northern and Western Europeans coming here. The Irish are pushed out of Europe for economic reasons, namely the potato famine. It strikes in the mid-1840s. It affects potato plants all across Ireland, and the failure of essentially the entire potato crop for several years leads to unprecedented disaster. Nearly 1 million Irish die of starvation, and another 1 million migrate. They get out of there. German immigrants are also pushed out of Europe because of economic hardship. There's civil unrest at home, there's food riots, there's severe unemployment, and the more favorable economic conditions in North America, in the United States, they serve as a pull factor. In the 1860s, there's a civil war in the United States and immigration declines. No one's trying to go to a country that's at war with itself. The second peak in immigration during this time period begins in the 1880s when several European populations enter stage 2 of the demographic transition. Those who couldn't find land to farm, they moved to the cities or they migrated abroad for jobs or farmland elsewhere. In the 1890s, we're going to see another slowdown. The United States is in a recession. People are not trying to come here. This brings us to our third wave of immigration, which occurs between 1900 and 1915, just at the turn of the century. And instead of Northern and Western Europeans coming, this time the majority of immigrants are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, from countries like Italy, Russia, and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And this coincides with the diffusion of the Industrial Revolution to these regions. Populations are growing rapidly due to improved technology in agriculture and healthcare, and the population pressures that result, especially with land shortages, serve as a push factor for these immigrants. In Russia, the factors are a little bit different. Around this time, there's a revolution in Russia, there's a civil war, and this is going to send many Russians packing their bags to the United States. Okay, in the 1930s and 1940s, there's another decline in immigration, this time due to the Great Depression. And this brings us to the late 20th century. Between the 1950s and the 70s, immigration starts to climb again. And from the mid-60s or the 1970s up until today, we've seen historic highs in immigration. But the source of these immigrants is different than before. And let's take a second to review here. Remember that before the 1890s, most immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe. Then around the turn of the century, we see a different wave. where most immigrants are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Today, most immigrants are not coming from Europe, they're coming instead from Asia and Latin America. Looking at Asia first, the greatest number of immigrants have come from China, then the Philippines, India, and then Vietnam in that order. When we look at Latin America, the greatest number of immigrants clearly come from Mexico. In fact, Mexico has surpassed Germany as our biggest immigrant contributor today. Many immigrants also come from Dominican Republic and Haiti and El Salvador. A lot of this immigration is explained by economic push factors. There are several Caribbean nations in stage 2 of the demographic transition. They're experiencing rapid population growth that's putting pressure on resources, putting pressure on jobs, and that's spilling over, it's transferring into immigration to the United States where there's the perception of greater economic opportunity. Many Latin American and Asian immigrants came here as political refugees. 600,000 Cubans fled Cuba after Fidel Castro came to power during the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and in the 1980s, another 125,000 Cubans came here as well. We've seen nearly 800,000 Vietnamese migrants immigrate to the United States since the Vietnam War back in the 70s. Many of these were the so-called boat people who openly supported our US-backed government in South Vietnam, but who were forced to flee as political refugees after American forces withdrew from Vietnam. Many of them drifted into the South China Sea. They were hoping to be picked up by the US Navy, and thus they became dubbed the boat people. Alright, next we're going to be looking at US internal migration patterns. And when we do that, as you can see, there's going to be 5 time periods that we'll be discussing. First, let's look at colonial settlement patterns. Colonists settled mostly along the Atlantic coast because they depended on trade with Europe. That's where the shipping links were to receive products, to export raw materials. And anyway, settlement in the interior was hindered by an intervening obstacle, the Appalachian Mountains. Thick forests, steep slopes, there were not a lot of gaps that allowed passage. And there's also the hostile natives who didn't appreciate white people claiming the land they were already living on. During the 1800s, we see major improvements in transportation that helped to open up the interior of the continent, at least between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. The building of canals like the Erie Canal, which connected New York and the Great Lakes, the diffusion of steam-powered ships further speeded up water travel, and as a result, people were pulled west by opportunities to obtain large amounts of land at a low price. Between the 1840s and the 1890s, the United States experiences a gold rush in the West, which prompts quick migration to California, completely bypassing the Great Plains region. Essentially, westward expansion halts from North Dakota south to Texas because people didn't have the technology to overcome the dry climate there, the lack of trees, the tough soil of the Great Plains, and ironically, today this is one of the richest farming areas in the country. Alright, the period from about the 1890s to the 1940s is when we see the Great Plains region being settled. Expansion of the railroads spurred western migration. The federal government was giving huge grants of land to the railroad companies to lay down tracks. The railroad companies were turning around, parceling out that land, making a killing off of it, selling it to farmers who could now ship their products from the Great Plains to the cities along the Atlantic coast. Moving forward to the 1940s to the present, we've seen increasing southern migration. Americans are migrating south primarily for job opportunities, but also for environmental reasons. We often call the South the Sun Belt because of its temperate climate. And as people gain more leisure time, they're lured to the Sun Belt for outdoor recreation throughout the year. Alright, that was certainly a lot of information to digest. Let's take a minute to review these 5 periods of migration. Okay, on the back of your paper, we're going to add a section. I want you to create a section and title it Migration of African Americans. Migration of African Americans. Net migration of African Americans historically has followed a different pattern than what we've seen. A century ago, most African Americans lived in the South because their ancestors had been forced to migrate there as slaves. During the 1900s, though, large numbers of blacks moved from the South to take jobs in the large industrial cities of the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. All right, underneath that section, I want you to create one more section. I want you to title it Migration Within Regions. Migration Within Regions. In general, there's far more people that move within the same region, or what we call intra-regional migration, than between regions, or what we might call interregional migration. In developing countries, the trend we see with intra-regional migration is predominantly rural to urban. People are moving from the country to the city. They're being pushed by declining opportunities in farming and in agriculture, and they're being pulled to the cities by the prospect of work in factories or in service industries. An example of this is Brazil. The city of Sao Paulo has reached 300,000 people on average per year, migrants per year. But of course, the push factors there, they're based on perceptions. The perception that jobs exist in those cities when in fact they may not. In more developed countries like the United States, there's a different intra-regional trend. Rather than moving from the country to the city, most migration in the United States and in Western Europe is actually from the city to suburban areas. People are moving out from the central cities and out to the suburban communities that surround them. So a local example would be the many families that moved from LA to the surrounding suburbs like Pomona, Riverside, and even Moreno Valley and Paris here. We describe this trend as counter-urbanization, and it's really something that began in the late 1900s in more developed countries like North America and Western Europe, where more people are now immigrating into rural areas than are in fact immigrating out of them. And this results from the rapid expansion of suburbs and suburban communities in these places. And because of modern transportation and modern forms of communication in a developed country, no place today really is truly isolated like rural parts of developing countries very often are. And if we want to identify some push factors here, they're easy. People move out of cities, they move out of central cities for lifestyle reasons. They want to escape the traffic. They want to escape inner city crime and inner city pollution. They want to get away from the hustle and bustle and the frantic pace of big city life. And houses in the suburbs are often cheaper. There's more land available. And if you're a home buyer, this may mean the difference between a one-bedroom loft in a city versus a four-bedroom home with a garage and a yard in the suburbs at the same price.